Creator is that voice that comes up with all the tangible things. Creator has instruments.
Hello, my name is Leander, Rabe, and I'm with Healings and Associates. And today I just want to talk a little bit more with you about our leadership and some of the preferences we have and how that plays together. We're definitely a time of great uncertainty, and we're really uncertain about how things might look after this current crisis has passed. A lot of people will hope that everything goes back to the way it was, and yet there's others who are saying the new normal is going to be different no matter what we would prefer. But just even that word prefer talks about preferences. If you've ever heard of Carl Jung's theory, he looked at preferences that we have in 4 different areas of our life of how we like to do our work and do life. And there's many more preferences than just 4 groups, but he looked at 4 different categories. And so I'm going to talk about a couple different ways that can play out in our leadership as we think about ourselves and the others that we work with around us. One of those would happen to be what we call an ISTP, all right? And so I stands for the person who, when it comes to their relationships, they are more of an introvert. Some people think of that as they're just quiet. Well, it's much deeper than that. This person at times may extrovert. We will move around in these different preferences. It's just their go-to or their default setting is they are more introverted than extroverted. So they would prefer to do things more privately. So they will relate to less people and maybe on a deeper level. They will do their thinking and processing as they interact with people. They do that in a private way. And so they think in order to speak. The sensor is someone who really values the nitty-gritty details when it comes to data. They can look at the same data as someone else, and yet they will prefer to order and make the data sequential. So their spreadsheet will have many tabs, and they would like to just really understand the deep inner workings of that data on a minute level. Then we have those who are thinkers. And thinker is just simply talking about people who have a preference to make decisions that are more rational and analytical in nature. So they're looking at past policy, laws, regulations, things like that that would really affect that decision. And then they'll make their decision based on what makes sense. It's just logical that we would do this. This is what's right because it just makes sense. And so they are more of a thinker orientation in their kind of decision making. And then we have someone who, in their preferences, the way they like to structure and order their world is they are more of a perceiver. A perceiver is seen as someone who's really adaptable, they're fluid, they're sort of going with the flow, if you will, when it comes to making a decision. And if it's due Friday at midnight, they're going to wait till Friday at 11:59 p.m. Why? Because perceivers are constantly gathering more data. They can be seen as procrastinators, which they can, but it's something deeper that's going on. They are waiting to make their decision because they never know if they might find some new data. So as opposed to things being expressly stated and planned and out there for everyone to see, they'll in turn say, well, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. Why? Well, they're gathering more data and they're processing sometimes very intensely. But it's something that's an ongoing process all the way to the very end for them. And in fact, after the decision made, they're very willing to come back and wanting to reopen it maybe a week or 2 later because they've gathered more data. That's just part of their process. So the question we have is, we are in this time of crisis, but even coming back up the other side, what would we experience with an ISTP? And with an ISTP, you find a leader who actually can come across as a little bit detached at times, and that's for several reasons. Without even realizing it, the ISTP is naturally distancing themselves to a little bit to avoid all the emotional responses and the emotional chaos that could be there in a time of crisis or coming out on the back end. And they're trying to find some calm waters, if you will, for themselves. And they are introverted in their thinking, so they're constantly pondering their own thoughts in an attempt to be rational and reasonable because they're a thinker in their decision making, and they're slowly ruling out other ideas before coming to their own conclusions. And they're often private about how they even came to those conclusions. You'd really have to probe with them and find out and dig deeper and really peel back the layers to understand how they got to that decision. But because of their unique thinking process, you find them a lot of times working on small steps that they can control. And coming out of a crisis period, the ISTP has some well-reasoned action plans that they're ready to move on because there's going to be a lot of work to do, and they're ready to do it and just get going. And they've really thought out their process and those action plans. The ISTP, interestingly enough, can come across as being disengaged or lacking the needed urgency. I remember early on in this coronavirus crisis that we're in, I talked with a leader who was an ISTP, and I was just really not surprised because I knew their hardwiring, the preferences that they have as a leader, but their affect was just one of just very low key and just sort of like, well, yeah, you know, it's happening and we'll see what happens. And they were, because of this, this affect that they can have and the processing that they're doing privately, the ISTP leaders need to realize the perception their followers might have of them and work extra hard at connecting with their team and actually providing support and expressing concern for their team members. They also need to seek feedback from their team and maybe some peers around them throughout the crisis and afterwards in their action steps so as not to move too slowly or with a lack of urgency. Their team may need them to actually rise up and show stronger, more present leadership, if you will. You see, managing our hardwiring is a critical competency as a leader, both in times of crisis and in leading people to the new realities after the crisis. Well, there's another leader we want to look at. They have some different preferences, actually quite different. This leader is what we would call an ENFJ. And so this person is actually more extroverted in their relating with other people. So they are very quick to be interactive. They're going to be someone who thinks out loud. They speak in order to think. The introvert is thinking in order to speak, total opposites. And so you have someone who's just thinking as they go and thinking out loud. And if they can get some other extroverts to do that with, wow, this is fantastic. And it can be quite a party as well. We also have this person who is looking at the data in a different way. They are more intuitive in their look at the data. They want to fly at more of a 10,000 foot view over perhaps the same data as the sensor we saw earlier, but they're looking for trends and patterns in the data. So you think forest and the trees, this person is leaning towards the forest and they want to see the whole forest. And hey, I see that there's 25 acres of birch trees here. And oh, look at that, there's 50 acres of a pasture over there in this forest. Meanwhile, the sensor has gone tree by tree and they're measuring every piece of information they can get from tree by tree by tree. Very different approaches to the same data. We have here a person who makes decisions as a feeler. They're looking at the decision not so much as what's rational, what makes sense, and what past practices, laws, and policies will tell us, but they're going to look at the decision and say, hey, how is this going to impact people? So they can become very subjective in their decision making because every time they're like, well, this is a different set of circumstances. We got to look at what our values are and how they apply to this situation. And so we might make somewhat of a different decision than what the policy says because this is what's best for the people in that moment, moment by moment. We have then a person who, as they like to structure and order their world, they're called a judger. If we go back to Carl Jung's theory, this person's not judgmental. That's not what we mean. But they're talking about the fact that this person likes to look at a couple options, make a decision and move on because there's a lot of other judgments to make or decisions to make. And so you come back to them 2 weeks later and they're like, hey, that ship has sailed. We made that decision and we got to move on. Let's go. And they don't want to reopen that because they made that decision. They're also more structured on their calendar. They're time-based. They're very aware of their calendar. They like to make plans in advance. My son is a perceiver. I am a judger. So I will call him and say, hey, you want to get together next Tuesday? I'll be driving by your exit on the highway. And he'll say, what? I don't know, maybe, right? He's going to wait and say, hey, why don't you give me a call? Oh, I'm like, oh, great. Hey, I'll call you the night before. Let's confirm. He's like, no. Call me the day up. I mean, my head explodes because I'm a judger. I want to make those plans. I've got a million other plans to make and move on. So that tells you a little bit more about that person and their preferences, right? Well, with our preferences, as some are more extroverted, we have this question of what would we expect from an ENFJ both in the time of crisis, but coming out of that on the other side, you'll find for them a leader who really closes the power distance gap for their followers. They're going to be very focused, but it's a roll up their sleeves and dive in along with their team to make the difference. And they're going to be right next to those people, shoulder to shoulder on the front lines. The ENFJ is constantly going to be checking in on their team members and supporting them every step of the way, especially into that new normal that we're going to be facing here in the coming weeks and months. The extroverted feeling of an ENFJ is really concerned with the harmony of the team or of the community, bringing people together and caring for them. Because they're an extroverted feeler, they're great at reading the emotions of others. They have high emotional intelligence, and thus they're big empathizers in the process. So one of the things of this, you really love to have the ENFJ on your team when there's uncertainty like there has been and there will be coming out of this coronavirus crisis. However, the ENFJ leader needs to remember to pace themselves because it's important for them because they've got to realize this is a marathon, not a sprint, because they can burn out with nonstop effort. It's also important for ENFJs to practice self-care. It's that grabbing the oxygen mask for yourself before you help all the other people around you in the plane kind of concept. Because if not, several things can happen. They are so quick to dive in and help that they are actually enabling poor performance by some members of their team. And then they also, as a leader themselves, can crash and burn physically or emotionally at some point the longer the crisis continues and the uncertainty. So again, managing our preferences as leaders helps us to play to our strengths and not fall victim to our Achilles heels that we all have. It just depends on what our preferences are. Well, that's it for today. To learn more about our preferences in leadership or anything else, watch our coaching clips on Healings and Associates. That's healingsandassociates.com. And if we can help you in any way, contact myself or Daily Healings. It's great seeing you. Thanks for watching. Take care.
Creator is that voice that comes up with all the tangible things. Creator has instruments.